Eleanor Farrow, Duchess of Rivenhall, stood at the edge of her own ballroom and watched her husband seat another woman in her chair. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She did not look toward the doorway where 140 guests had gone suddenly, carefully quiet. The particular quiet of people pretending very hard not to be listening. The footman beside her still held her abandoned plate of ratafia biscuits. Uncertain what to do with it now that the woman he had been serving had no chair to eat them in. Eleanor took the plate from his hands, set it on the mantel with both palms, and held it there a moment longer than she needed to, feeling the cool marble under her fingers, letting it tell her hands what to do while the rest of her decided what to feel. Mrs. Celia Norwood settled into the Duchess's chair the way water settles into a low place in a field, not triumphantly, not even willingly, but because gravity had arranged it, and no one in the room had thought to ask if the water minded. Julian Farrow, 9th Duke of Rivenhall, stood behind that chair with his hand resting on its carved back, and he did not look at his wife at all. He was speaking to Lord Aldous about drainage rights on the eastern boundary, as though nothing in the room had shifted, as though he had not just, in front of the whole of Wraxham society, given his wife's seat to his mistress. By morning it would be the only thing anyone in the county remembered about the Rivenhall autumn ball, and Eleanor Farrow intended, before that morning came, to make certain it was not the only thing they remembered about her. She turned the garnet ring on her third finger once, a full, slow revolution, the way she had turned it every day for 3 years, without her husband ever once asking why. It had been her mother's. It had been the last warm thing her mother's hand had done before it went cold, pressed into Eleanor's palm with a strength that had surprised them both, and the words that came with it, Eleanor, had kept the way other women kept scripture. Being needed is not the same as being loved, Eleanor. Do not let anyone teach you they are the same coin. She had married a duke who had, without ever intending unkindness, spent 3 years teaching her exactly that lesson, and she had let him, because she had told herself that a woman who managed 40 rooms and 11 tenant farms and a household of 30 servants without complaint was, in some fashion she had not examined too closely, doing something that resembled love. Tonight had corrected the arithmetic for her. The county of Wraxham in the autumn of 1819 was not a place that forgot things, and Eleanor understood, standing very still in her green silk, with her hands finally quiet at her sides, that she had roughly 9 hours before the story hardened into the shape it would keep for the rest of her life. She could spend those 9 hours weeping into a pillow at Rivenhall, and by spring she would be the Duchess who had been replaced at her own ball, pitied at assemblies, seated lower at dinners, her invitations thinning the way invitations thin around a woman the world has decided is finished. Or she could spend those 9 hours doing what she had always done, which was work. She chose the second thing, before the orchestra had finished its second dance. The season had come to Wraxham that year the way it always did, indifferent to who in the county was thriving, and who was merely enduring. Heavy September heat breaking into a cool, damp October. The harvest coming in late and hard across 3,000 acres of Rivenhall land, the hedgerows going red before anyone had leisure to admire them. Eleanor Colney had come to that land 3 years earlier, as a bride of 22, the only daughter of a modest, well-regarded Wraxham family, whose chief asset, everyone agreed privately, was her father's excellent management of his own small estate, and his daughter's excellent management of everything else. The match with the young Duke of Rivenhall had surprised no one who understood arithmetic. Julian Farrow needed a duchess who could run an estate the size of a small kingdom without draining it, and Eleanor Colney had been raised by a widowed father to keep books before she could keep countenance. It had not been called a love match by anyone, including, eventually, the two people inside it. Julian was not unkind. That was the maddening, unbudgeable centre of the thing. Eleanor could not build a grievance out of cruelty, because he had never once been cruel to her on purpose. He was courteous. He deferred to her on household matters without argument. He had, in 3 years, raised his voice to her exactly never. What he had not done, not once, in 3 years, was ask her a single question about herself that was not functional. He asked about the accounts. He asked about the tenants. He asked whether the east wing roof had been seen to before winter. He had never asked what she read in the evenings, or why she wore her mother's ring every day, or what she had wanted at 22, before she had wanted anything else. She had told herself for a long while that this was simply how great houses were run, that warmth was a luxury item, like hothouse fruit, and that a well-managed marriage did not require it any more than a well-managed ledger required decoration. She had told herself this especially hard in the last year, since Mrs. Celia Norwood, a young widow newly arrived in the county with a small income and a large amount of unclaimed time, had begun appearing wherever Julian appeared, at the Fenbridge Assembly, at the county agricultural meeting, in his curricle on the Ashendale Road on a Tuesday when he had told Eleanor he would be inspecting drainage. Eleanor had not accused him of anything. She had no evidence of anything to accuse him of, beyond a pattern she had noted the way she noted everything, in the private ledger she kept in the drawer of her writing desk, not of household expenses, but of her husband, dated and factual, the only place she permitted herself to write down what she would not permit herself to say aloud. March the 9th. He rode to Fenbridge without mentioning it beforehand. Mrs. N. was seen there, June the 2nd. He asked after the eastern fences. He did not ask after my health, though I had been unwell 3 days. August the 14th. He gave Mrs. N. his arm into supper at the Aldous dinner. I was seated with the vicar. She had not shown the ledger to anyone. It was not, she told herself, evidence of anything but her own unhappiness, and she had a horror of being the kind of woman who complained. She had kept it the way she kept everything that could not be resolved through work, filed, dated, and set aside in the drawer of her mind she had learned, since her mother's death 9 years before, to close on command. She permitted herself grief in careful doses. 15 minutes, on the anniversary of her mother's death, sitting in the walled garden with the ring turned 3 times. No more. Grief, unrationed, she had decided at 13 years old, was a door that did not close again once you let it stand open, and she had watched her mother's death nearly take her father through that door with her, and she had resolved, small and fierce even then, never to walk through it herself. So when the ball came, and Julian gave Mrs. Norwood her chair, Eleanor did what she had trained herself for 11 years to do. She rationed it. She gave herself the length of one dance, perhaps 4 minutes, to feel the full weight of what had happened, standing very still by the mantel with her hand on a plate of biscuits nobody wanted, and then she closed the drawer, turned the ring once more, and began, in the back of her mind where the real work of her life was always done, to make a list. The list had 3 items on it by the time the second dance ended. The first was that she required an ally in the room who would tell her the truth without softening it. The second was that she required to know, precisely and in writing, what her own resources were, what was hers by settlement. what income she controlled outright, what she could do without asking Julian's permission for anything. The third item, the one she wrote last and pressed hardest into the ledger of her mind, was simpler than the other two, and it was the one that would carry her through the winter. Find out why, not why he had chosen Mrs. Norwood's company. She suspected that was, in its way, beside the point. But why a man who had never raised his voice to her, never once been unkind, had nonetheless spent 3 years failing to see her at all? That question had teeth in it, and Eleanor Farrow was a woman who did not leave a ledger unbalanced if she could help it. "You are not eating," said a voice at her elbow, and Eleanor turned to find Mrs. Prudence Hale, who had kept house at Rivenhall for 31 years and answered to no one's opinion of her bluntness, holding out a second plate of biscuits as though the first humiliating one had never existed. "I find I have lost my appetite for ratafia," Eleanor said. "I don't wonder." Mrs. Hale did not lower her voice, which was, Eleanor understood, itself a kind of loyalty, a refusal to treat the thing as shameful enough to whisper about. "I've kept house here since before that man was out of short coats, Your Grace, and I'll tell you plain, because nobody else in this room has the nerve. What he did tonight was a small, careless, cowardly thing, and it will cost him a great deal more than he thinks it will." "Will it?" "Watch," said Mrs. Hale, and pressed the plate into Eleanor's hands, and walked away before anyone could accuse either of them of conspiring. Eleanor did not watch, not then. She set the plate down, unfinished, on the sideboard, and crossed the ballroom floor toward the terrace doors with her chin at the exact angle she had practised in the mirror as a girl, for occasions requiring more composure than she felt, and it was there, at the terrace doors, with the cold October air coming through, in a thin grey ribbon, that Anthony Vale, Earl of Bramwell, stepped into her path and bowed. "Duchess," he said, "I find myself in want of a partner for the next set, and I notice, by some extraordinary accident, that you appear to be without a chair." The room had gone quiet again, that same listening quiet, because everyone present knew precisely what had happened 20 minutes earlier, and everyone present knew precisely who Anthony Vale was. The one man in 3 counties who had, before Julian Farrow's suit was ever announced, called at the Colney house with flowers and a proposal of his own, and been gently, honestly refused by a girl who had not loved him, and who had gone on, in the years since, to become his friend rather than his grievance, which was rarer than either of them let on. "My lord," Eleanor said, "I do not think it wise. I did not ask if it was wise." He held out his hand, palm up, patient, unhurried, the particular stillness of a man who has already decided to wait as long as necessary, and is in no hurry to announce it. "I asked if you would dance." She looked past his shoulder, once at the chair by the card tables, where her husband sat with Mrs. Norwood's fan resting, forgotten and proprietary, against his sleeve, and she looked back at Anthony Vale's open hand, and she thought, with the particular clarity of a woman doing arithmetic she has been putting off for 3 years, he has not once, in all this time, looked to see if I minded. She put her hand in the Earl of Bramwell's, and the county of Wraxham watched the Duchess of Rivenhall dance the second set with her husband's rival, while her husband sat 40 feet away and for the first time all evening looked directly at her. The dance was a simple country figure, nothing that required conversation, but Anthony Vale had never been a man who confused silence with nothing to say. "He is a fool," he said quietly on the turn, "and I do not say it to flatter you. I say it because it is arithmetic. A man does not misplace a duchess of your competence by accident. He does it because he has stopped counting what he has. You need not champion me, my lord. I am not. He turned her, correctly, precisely, the way he did everything. I am dancing with an old friend who was once kind enough to refuse me honestly instead of unkindly, and who deserves, at minimum, one dance in a room where she is not being managed like a household account. Eleanor did not smile. She had not smiled properly in some months, she realised, and this was not the occasion to begin, not with 140 pairs of eyes counting her expression like a ledger of their own. But something in her chest, some small cramped room that had been shut for a long while, opened half an inch, and she let it stay open for the length of the dance, and then she closed it again, gently, the way she closed everything, and thanked Lord Bramwell, and returned his bow, and did not look at her husband again for the rest of the evening. She did not need to. She could feel him watching her all the way to the carriage. The drive back to Rivenhall took 40 minutes in the dark, the lamps swinging, the two of them seated across from each other in a silence so complete that Eleanor could hear her own ring turning against her glove. Julian broke it once, somewhere past the Fenbridge crossroads. You danced with Bramwell. I did. People will talk. Eleanor looked at him then, really looked, for what felt like the first time in months, at the tired lines around his eyes that she had noticed and filed away, and never once asked about, at the hand that had rested so easily on another woman's chair 2 hours before. People, she said, have already been talking for an hour, Your Grace. I merely gave them a second subject. He said nothing more. The carriage rattled on through the dark, past hedgerows going bare, past the boundary stone that marked the start of Rivenhall land, and Eleanor sat with her hands folded and her ring turned, once, twice, 3 times, and thought, by morning I will have a list, and by spring I will have a life that does not depend on whether he remembers to look at me. And one day, though he does not know it yet, he will learn what he called suitable instead of loved. The letter came from Mr. Silas Crane, the family's solicitor in Fenbridge, 4 days after the ball, in answer to the inquiry Eleanor had sent the very morning after, a plain, careful letter asking, without explanation, for a full accounting of her marriage settlement, her pin money, and any property that stood in her name alone. Mr. Crane's reply arrived with a thoroughness that suggested he had not questioned why a duchess might suddenly wish to know precisely what was hers, which Eleanor appreciated more than she could easily say. She had £400 a year in pin money, untouched by her husband's control, a small property in Fenbridge left to her by her mother that she had entirely forgotten she owned, and this was the item that made her sit very still at her writing desk for a full minute, the contractual right, under the terms of her marriage settlement, to review the Rivenhall estate accounts at any quarter day she chose, a right her father had insisted upon, and that no one, in 3 years, had ever mentioned to her again. She chose the very next quarter day. Julian did not object when she asked to see the books. He looked, in fact, faintly relieved, the way a man looks when a chore he had been quietly dreading is taken off his hands by someone competent, and Eleanor understood, reading that relief on his face, exactly how thoroughly he had filed her. Not as a wife, not even as an ornament, but as a capable pair of hands he could safely stop thinking about. It should have hurt more than it did. Perhaps, she thought, it had simply confirmed something she already suspected, and confirmation is a smaller wound than discovery. The estate books had been kept for the last 4 years chiefly by Reginald Farrow, Julian's cousin, and in the absence of a son, his heir presumptive, a smooth, agreeable man of 35 with an excellent tailor and an unfortunate habit of losing at cards in Fenbridge that everyone in the county politely pretended not to notice. Reginald had taken on the land agency after the old steward's death, at Julian's request, as a favour to a cousin who needed occupation and income, and he had managed it, by all outward appearances, competently enough that no one had thought to look closely. Eleanor looked closely. It was, after all, the one thing she had always been permitted to be excellent at. She spent the first week with the rent rolls spread across the library table, comparing tenant receipts against the ledger totals line by line, the way her father had taught her before she could properly hold a pen. The numbers will tell you the truth even when the people won't, Eleanor, if you are patient enough to make them speak. By the second week she had found the first inconsistency, the Hollow Farm rent, recorded in the ledger at £38 for the past 2 years, when the tenant himself, a plain-spoken man named Josiah Reeve, told her over a cup of tea in his own kitchen that he had paid £31. "I've the receipt Mr. Reginald wrote me, if it's wanted," Josiah said, wiping his hands on his apron, his young son Sam watching from the doorway with the frank, unembarrassed interest of a boy who has not yet learned that adults prefer their scandals conducted quietly. £31, writ plain. "I never questioned it, Your Grace. Man in his position, you don't." "You did nothing wrong, Mr. Reeve," Eleanor said, and meant it, and watched something in the farmer's shoulders come down half an inch, the particular relief of a man who has spent 2 years faintly afraid he had misremembered his own transactions. £7 don't sound like much, Sam offered from the doorway, but it's near a month's wages for our Tam. "It is exactly a month's wages for your Tam," Eleanor said, and wrote the figure down, and felt something in her own chest settle into a shape she recognised. Not anger, not yet, but the particular calm of a woman who has just found the first thread of a much larger knot, and knows, with total certainty, that she will not stop pulling until the whole of it is in her hands. By the end of the month she had found the same pattern on 4 more farms, a difference of £5 to £9 each, every discrepancy carried on a receipt in Reginald Farrow's own careful hand, every ledger entry adjusted upward by precisely the sum that vanished between the tenant's payment and the estate's books. It was not a fortune, taken farm by farm, taken across 11 tenancies over 4 years. It was very nearly £1,000, and Eleanor Farrow, sitting alone in the library with the true figures arranged in her own private ledger beside the false ones in the estate book, understood that she had found something considerably more dangerous to Reginald Farrow than an unhappy marriage. She did not go to Julian with it immediately. She had learned in 3 years that her husband did not respond well to accusations without proof, and she intended to hand him proof so complete that no defence could survive it, not because she doubted her own findings, but because she had decided, somewhere in the cold clarity of the weeks since the ball, that when she finally spoke to her husband about what she had found, she would speak to him as a woman presenting a closed case, not a wife voicing a grievance. There was, she admitted to herself, only once, in the privacy of the walled garden, a second reason. She wanted to see, before she said a word, whether he would notice the change in her without being told. He noticed the ledger work before he noticed anything else, which did not surprise her. "You've had the account books out every day this fortnight," Julian said one evening, finding her in the library at 9 o'clock, with ink on her fingers, and a stack of receipts organised into a fan across the table. He said it the way he said most things to her, mildly, an observation offered without much apparent weight behind it. And yet, he had not gone up to bed, she noticed. He had stood in the doorway a moment longer than the sentence required. "I have found the work interesting," she said, which was true, and safer than the truth beneath it. "You needn't trouble yourself with the tenant accounts. Reginald manages them." "I know precisely how Reginald manages them," Eleanor said, and looked up in time to see something cross her husband's face. Not alarm, not yet. Only the faint, unfocused unease of a man who has just heard a sentence he cannot place, but suspects he ought to remember. He did not ask what she meant. She did not tell him. It was, she thought, watching him go, the first exchange in 3 years in which she had held something back from him on purpose, and it felt less like deceit than like the first even breath she had taken in a long while. The Mistress campaign, as Eleanor privately named it, escalated in November with a thoroughness that suggested design rather than accident. Mrs. Norwood was seated beside Julian at the eldest dinner, walked beside him after church twice, driven in his curricle a 3rd time on a Tuesday, that had once again been described to Eleanor as devoted to drainage. Eleanor noted each instance in the private ledger she still kept, dated and factual, and noticed something new alongside the noting, a small, cold clarity that had not been there before the ball. She was not, she realised, frightened of losing her husband to Mrs. Norwood. She was building a case against being erased, and Julian's continued indifference to how the county read his behaviour was. Itself useful evidence, however little comfort it offered her at night. It was Mrs. Hale who told her, in the blunt way that had made her an ally worth having, that the county's opinion had already begun, unbidden, to turn. They talked of nothing but the ball for a fortnight, Mrs. Hale said, arranging linen with the brisk efficiency of a woman who considered gossip a household duty like any other. And then they talked of you dancing with Lord Bramwell for another fortnight. And now, Your Grace, if you'll permit me, they've started talking about the rents. The rents. You're not close-mouthed man, begging your pardon, and neither is his wife, and there's not a farmhouse between here and Fenbridge that hasn't heard by now that the Duchess herself came out to sit at a tenant's table and ask after his receipts, and found them wanting. That's not scandal, Your Grace. That's respect, and it moves through a county the way water moves downhill, slow at first. And then all at once. Eleanor said nothing to that, but she thought about it a great deal in the days that followed, and she thought too about her mother's ring, and the maxim that had gone with it, and she understood, with the particular precision of a woman finally solving a problem she had been circling for months, that she had spent 3 years asking to be seen, and that being seen, it turned out, was not a thing anyone could give her. It was a thing she was going to have to build, brick by brick, receipt by receipt, until it could not be denied. Winter closed over Rivenhall hard that year, the fields gone white by December, the household drawing in around its fires, and it was in the cold, close weeks before Christmas that the second half of the story began, the half in which Julian Farrow, 9th Duke of Rivenhall, began, for the first time in 3 years of marriage, to actually look at his wife. It started, as these things often do, with something small enough to be nearly nothing. Eleanor had taken to reviewing the estate correspondence in the evenings, in the library. At the same hour Julian generally retreated there with his brandy and his own papers, and for the better part of a week they worked in a silence that was not. Eleanor noted with some private surprise, uncomfortable, it was Julian who broke it. On the 4th evening, setting down a letter from his solicitor, with the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he dislikes. "Reginald tells me the Hollow Farm rent has been in arrears," he said. "He wishes to raise it by £4 against the shortfall." "Reginald is mistaken," Eleanor said, without looking up from her own papers. "The Hollow Farm rent has not been in arrears in 2 years. I have Mr. Reeves' receipts." Julian looked at her for a long moment. "You have his receipts." "I have all of their receipts, Your Grace, every tenant on this estate. I have spent the autumn collecting them." She set down her pen finally, and met his eyes across the space between their 2 chairs, and found, to her mild surprise, that she was not afraid of the conversation she was about to begin. "I would like to show you something, when you have an hour to spare that is not promised elsewhere. I have an hour now." She had not expected that. She took it anyway, and spread the 2 sets of figures across the library table between them, the estate ledger in Reginald's careful hand, and beside it her own reconstruction, farm by farm, drawn from the tenant's own receipts, and watched her husband's face change as the pattern became visible to him the way it had become visible to her, line by line, farm by farm, nearly £1,000 over 4 years, siphoned by a man he had trusted enough to hand the running of his own land. "This cannot be right," Julian said. And then, more quietly, the particular stillness gone out of him entirely. "How long have you known?" "Since October." She did not soften it. "Since a week after the ball, if you want the precise date." He was quiet for a moment. A long moment, in which Eleanor watched him look at the figures, and then at her, and then at the figures again, as though trying to reconcile 2 facts he had not previously understood to be connected: that his estate was being quietly bled by his own cousin, and that his wife had known it for 2 months, and told no one, least of all him. "Why did you not come to me the moment you found it?" "Because the last time I came to you with something that troubled me," Eleanor said, and her voice did not rise, did not crack, stayed level and clear the way it had stayed level and clear through 3 years of small erasures. "You told me people would talk. I decided I would rather bring you a case you could not argue with than a complaint you could set aside." "Eleanor, I am not finished," she said gently, and he closed his mouth, and waited, and she found, watching him wait, that this was the first time in 3 years he had waited on her rather than the reverse. "I am not angry with you about Reginald. I am telling you what I found because it is true, and because it is dangerous to this house, and because I think, whatever else you believe about me, you know I would not bring you false figures. But I would be lying if I told you that finding it was the only thing that occupied me this autumn. I have also been finding out what is mine, what income is my own, what property stands in my name, what I am owed by contract and not by your goodwill. I did that because I needed to know I would be well, Your Grace, regardless of what you decided to do with your evenings. The fire cracked in the grate. Neither of them moved to mend it. "You think I do not love you," Julian said at last, and it was not quite a question. "I think," Eleanor said, "that you have never once asked me a question that was not useful to you. I think you married a woman who could run this house without complaint, and you have spent 3 years treating that as the whole of what I am, and I think you gave my chair to another woman at our own ball, and did not understand, until Lord Bramwell asked me to dance, that anyone in that room considered it a loss." She paused. "I am not asking you to explain yourself tonight. I do not think you are ready to, and I would rather have the truth late than a comfortable lie early. But I wanted you to know what I have built while you were not looking, because I intend to keep building it, with or without your notice. Julian did not answer that night. He sat a long while after she had gone up, the ledgers still spread across the table, and Eleanor, undressing by candlelight in her own room, did not know what he thought or what he felt, and found, examining the fact, that she minded rather less than she once would have. She had said what was true. The rest was his arithmetic to do. He came to her 2 days later in the walled garden of all places, where she sat with her 15 minutes of permitted grief on the anniversary of nothing in particular. Simply an hour she had claimed for herself, the ring turned 3 times, the cold air sharp in her lungs. "My father used to say," Julian said, without preamble, sitting on the bench beside her, not touching her, that a pharaoh does not love his duchess. He maintains her. "Love," he said, "was the thing that took my mother from this house before I was 7 years old, and left my father a fool in front of the whole county, and he taught me, from the time I could understand him, that a man who loves his wife too visibly has handed her the means to ruin him." He looked at his hands. "I did not choose you for love, Eleanor. I chose you because you were the most capable woman I had ever met, and I told myself that was safer than the alternative. I have gone on telling myself that for 3 years, even as it became less and less true, because admitting it was not true any more felt like admitting my father had been wrong about everything, and I did not know what would be left of me if he had." Eleanor turned the ring once. "Your father sounds like a very frightened man. He was the least frightened man I ever knew." "No," she said, not unkindly. "He was the most frightened man you ever knew. He simply called it something else." She looked at him then, fully, for the first time in the conversation. "I am not going to tell you it is all right, Julian, because it is not yet. But I will tell you this. Show me. Not tonight, and not with words. Words are cheap, and you have never been short of them when it suited you. Show me, over time, that I am not an asset you are managing. That is the only apology I will accept, and it is the only one I am interested in receiving." He nodded once, and did not touch her, and Eleanor understood that this, the not touching, the taking of her terms without argument, was itself the first small brick of the thing she had told him she intended to build. "The ring," he said, before she rose to go in. "You turn it, every day. I have watched you do it for 3 years and never asked. It was my mother's." Eleanor looked down at it, garnet catching the thin winter light. "She gave it to me the hour she died. She told me that being needed and being loved were not the same coin, and that I was not to let anyone teach me otherwise." She stood. "You very nearly did, Your Grace. I would like it noted for the record that you did not succeed. That winter the ledger against Reginald Farrow grew heavier by the week, and Eleanor grew alongside it, careful in a new way, not because she trusted her husband less, but because she understood, now that he knew what she had found, that Reginald would soon understand it too. And a cornered man with 4 years of theft to answer for was not a man who could be relied upon to behave honourably. She was right to be careful. In January, Reginald came to her in the library on a morning Julian had ridden out to Fenbridge, smooth and warm as poured cream, and suggested, with every appearance of concern, that a duchess who meddled too visibly in estate business risked being thought unwomanly by the county, and that perhaps, for her own reputation's sake of course, she might leave the tenant accounts to him going forward. "I find the county has thought a good many things of me this winter, Mr. Farrow," Eleanor said, not looking up from her papers, "and unwomanly is not among the ones that have reached me. You mistake my meaning. I do not think I do." She set down her pen. You are welcome to explain the £4 discrepancy on the Hollow Farm rent whenever it is convenient for you. I have found it a very interesting puzzle. Something moved behind Reginald's eyes, not fear, not yet, but the first flicker of a man recalculating how much time he had left. He bowed and left, and Eleanor wrote the exchange into her private ledger with the same flat factual hand she used for everything, and underlined once the word interesting, because she had learned watching her husband's cousin for 4 months that cowards revealed themselves fastest when you handed them a small amount of rope and waited. The counterpunch came a week later, and it was cleverer than Eleanor had allowed for. Reginald produced, before Julian, a sworn statement from a Fenbridge attorney of dubious standing, alleging that the tenant receipts Eleanor had collected were themselves unreliable, that Josiah Reeve and 3 other farmers, being simple men easily flattered by a duchess's personal attention, had misremembered or exaggerated their payments in the excitement of the thing, and that the estate ledgers, kept in good faith over 4 years, ought to be trusted over the recollection of tenants eager to please. It was, Eleanor admitted privately, a good lie. It cost nothing to make, and would be expensive to disprove. And it had the additional cruelty of casting doubt, not on her arithmetic, but on the honesty of the very people who had trusted her with their receipts. She did not panic. She did not even raise her voice when Julian showed her the statement, his jaw tight, waiting to see what she would do with it. "He has made a mistake," she said, reading it through twice. "He has made an accusation that will be difficult to answer without dragging 4 farming families into a dispute they did not ask for." "He has made a mistake," Eleanor said again, "because he has named the 4 families specifically in a sworn document, which means the statement can be tested. I intend to test it. At the harvest assembly, in front of the whole parish, where Mr. Breeder, Reeve and his neighbours can answer for themselves whether they were flattered into lying, or whether they were paid exactly what their own receipts, in Reginald's own hand, say they were paid." She looked at her husband. "I would like your support at that assembly, Your Grace. Not your rescue. Your support." "You have it," Julian said without hesitation, and Eleanor found, hearing the speed of the answer, that it mattered to her more than she had expected it to. The Wraxham Harvest Assembly was held that year in the last week of January, delayed past its usual autumn date by a wet season and a late final threshing, and it drew, as it always did, the whole of the parish into the long tithe barn on the edge of Fenbridge, tenants and gentry alike, seated on rough benches under the high beams, the air thick with the smell of new straw and old wood smoke. It was not, ordinarily, a venue for reckonings. That was precisely why Eleanor had chosen it. A magistrate's hearing could be closed to the public. A tithe barn could not. She stood at the front of the room, in her plainest good dress, the ledgers arranged on the trestle table before her, Julian at her right hand, and Mr. Silas Crane, the family solicitor, at her left, and she did not raise her voice, because she had learned, across a marriage and a winter, that a woman who does not need to shout is the most difficult kind of opponent to argue with. "Mr. Farrow has sworn," she said, when the room had settled, "that the tenant receipts I collected this autumn are unreliable, that Josiah Reeve, Thomas Ames, William Colt, and Peter Danby exaggerated or misremembered their rents out of eagerness to please. I have asked each of these men to be here today, not to defend themselves, but to answer one question, in their own words, before their neighbours." She looked out over the benches. "Mr. Reeve," What did you pay for Hollow Farm this Michaelmas past? Josiah Reeves stood, turning his hat in his hands, and Eleanor watched the room lean in, the particular silence of a county listening for a verdict. £31, he said. Writ plain on the receipt Mr. Reginald gave me himself. I've no reason to lie about it, Your Grace, and no gift for remembering numbers I didn't pay. Thank you, Mr. Reeve. Eleanor turned to the ledger, open on the table, and read aloud, clear and unhurried, the figure recorded there. £38. A difference of 7, recorded in the estate accounts in Mr. Farrow's own hand, in the same week Mr. Reeve's own receipt, also in Mr. Farrow's hand, records 31. She let that sit a moment before she called the next name. Mr. Ames, what did you pay for the Water Meadow lease? One by one, the 4 tenants stood, and one by one, plain men in their good coats turned their hats in their hands and told the truth in front of their neighbours, unbidden, unrehearsed, because it cost them nothing to say what they had always known and everything. Eleanor understood, watching them, to be believed at last. The room's temperature changed as they spoke. She could feel it the way one feels weather turning. A low murmur building at the back of the barn. Glances passing from bench to bench. The tide of 8 months of gossip, finally finding its true direction. Reginald Farrow, seated near the front in his excellent coat, had gone very still. I would remind Your Grace, he said, when Eleanor turned to him at last, his voice pitched for charm and finding, in the room's new silence none of its usual purchase, that 4 receipts prove a bookkeeping irregularity. They do not prove intent. You are quite right, Eleanor said, which is why I did not stop at 4. She lifted a second ledger from the table, a leather-bound book, Mr. Crane had spent 3 weeks quietly assembling from every tenancy on the estate, cross-checked against every receipt she had gathered since October. This is a full accounting of all 11 Rivenhall tenancies over the past 4 years, Mr. Farrow, comparing your ledger entries against the tenants' own receipts, in your own hand, which you were kind enough not to destroy. The discrepancy totals £962. I invite you to explain, to this room, how a bookkeeping irregularity comes to always favour the bookkeeper. The silence that followed was not the listening silence of before. It was the silence of a room recalibrating, all at once, the way a tide turns, not gradually, but at a single visible moment, when the water simply begins moving the other way. Reginald Farrow stood, opened his mouth, and found. Eleanor saw with something that was not quite satisfaction, and not quite pity, that he had no sentence prepared that would survive being said aloud in that barn. I have debts, he said finally, very quietly, and it was the truest thing he had said all winter. I have debts, and I meant to repay it before anyone noticed. You did not mean to repay it, Julian said, standing for the first time, and his voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried the particular weight of a man who has stopped, at last, protecting someone out of habit. You meant not to be caught. There is a difference, Reginald, and I am sorry it took me 4 years and my wife's arithmetic to learn it. Eleanor could have let the room's anger do the rest. She felt it gathering, ready to be pointed, and she understood that she held, in that moment, more power over Reginald Farrow's fate than she had ever held over anything in her life. She thought of her mother's ring, and the maxim that went with it, and she thought, too, of what mercy dispensed from a position of weakness was worth against what mercy dispensed from a position of strength could mean. I will not have him prosecuted, she said, and felt the room startle at that. Felt Julian's eyes on her. I want the full sum restored, from his own income and property, over whatever term Mr. Crane deems fair. And I want him gone from the management of this estate today, and from this county within the month. But I will not make a spectacle of a man's ruin when his restitution serves this parish better than his punishment would. Every tenant shortchanged on this estate will be repaid in full, with interest, by Lady Day. That is the only satisfaction I require. She looked at Reginald, whose face had gone the colour of old paper. It costs me nothing to be merciful, Mr. Farrow. I want you to understand that clearly. I could destroy you today, in front of everyone who has ever admired your coat, and no one in this room would think the worse of me for it. I am choosing not to, because I find I would rather be known as a woman who builds than a woman who burns. See that you deserve the choice. It was Mrs. Hale, afterward, who told her that half the tithe barn had exhaled audibly at those words, as though the whole parish had been holding its breath since October, and only now remembered how to let it go. The weeks after the assembly were quieter than Eleanor had expected quiet to be. Reginald Farrow left Wraxham before the month was out, his restitution arranged in strict quarterly payments under Mr. Crane's unforgiving supervision, and the county, true to Mrs. Hale's prediction, turned its talk toward the Duchess, who had uncovered a theft with her own arithmetic and shown mercy with her own voice, and Eleanor found herself, for the first time in 3 years, greeted at the Fembridge shops with something that was not politeness but genuine warmth, the particular deference a community pays to a person it has decided all at once to respect. It was Mrs. Norwood who came to Rivenhall in February, unannounced, asking to see the Duchess alone, and Eleanor, who might once have refused the request out of pride, found she was curious enough to grant it. Celia Norwood was younger than Eleanor had allowed herself to notice at any of the assemblies where she had seen her on Julian's arm, and frightened in a way that surprised her. "I did not come here to ask forgiveness I have not earned," Celia said, twisting her gloves in her lap. "I came to tell you the truth, because I find I cannot carry it any longer without saying it to someone. Reginald Farrow held my late husband's debts, your Grace, nearly £400, which I had no means to repay. He told me, quite plainly, that the debts would be forgiven if I made myself visible at the Duke's side, enough to be noticed, enough to be talked of. He never told me what purpose it served him. I did not ask. I am ashamed to say I did not want to know badly enough to ask." She looked up. "I never gave your husband cause to look at me the way he looked at you tonight in the barn, your Grace. I want you to know that, whatever else is true, there was never anything between us worth the cost it has plainly been to you." Eleanor studied her a long moment, the frayed edge of her glove, the particular exhaustion of a woman who has spent a year being used and calling it opportunity because the alternative was worse. "Are the debts forgiven now, with Reginald gone?" "I do not know. I have had no word." "You will," Eleanor said, "because I will see to it myself, and you will not owe me for the seeing to it. I do not think you the villain of this winter, Mrs. Norwood, whatever the county has decided to say over its tea. I think you a woman who was given an impossible choice by a man skilled at making impossible choices look simple. Go and build something of your own now that the debt is lifted. That is the only repayment I require." Celia Norwood left Rivenhall in tears that were not, Eleanor understood, performed for anyone's benefit, and Eleanor stood a long while at the drawing-room window after she had gone, watching the carriage roll away down the drive, and thought that mercy, dispensed twice now in the same season, had cost her nothing, and given her back something she had not known she was missing, the sense that she was, in fact, the kind of woman who could afford to be generous, because she had finally stopped needing anyone's permission to know her own worth. Julian found her there. "I owe you an explanation," he said, "and I understand now that an explanation and an apology are not the same thing, and that you are owed both, in full, without either one standing in for the other." He did not sit. He stood before her the way a man stands before a magistrate, hands loose at his sides, and told her, without softening any of it, the whole of what his father's doctrine had cost him, the mother who had left when he was 7. The old Duke's cold verdict that love had been her weapon and his father's ruin. The boy who had grown into a man who mistook competence for safety, and safety for the whole of what a marriage required. "I chose you because you would never need saving, and I told myself that not needing to save you meant I did not need to love you either, and I was wrong about the second half of that arithmetic for the whole of our marriage. And I am sorry, Eleanor, not sorry in the way that asks you to make it easy for me. Sorry in the way that means I intend to spend a great deal of time proving it, whether or not you ever tell me I have succeeded." Eleanor let the silence hold a moment before she answered, because she had learned, this winter, that silence was not a thing to be afraid of filling. "I accept the explanation," she said. "I am not yet ready to accept the apology as finished, because an apology is not a sentence, Julian. It is a practice, and I have not seen enough of the practice yet to know if it will hold." She turned the ring once. "Here are my terms, and I would like you to hear them as terms, not as forgiveness dressed up in a gentler word. I will keep the estate accounts, permanently, not as a favour to you, but as a right I have earned, and do not intend to surrender. I will not be seated beneath any woman at any table in this county again, for any reason, and if it happens I expect you to correct it before I am required to. I will not mediate between you and your fear of your father's ghost, that labour is yours to do, not mine to manage on top of everything else I already manage. And I will not be thanked for my competence in place of being loved for myself. If those terms are agreeable, we may begin again. If they are not, I will go on very well regardless, and I would rather you know that now than discover it later." "They are agreeable," Julian said. All right then." He looked, for the first time in 3 years, almost unsteady, a duke without the practised ease that had carried him through every room he had ever entered. "And that is the whole of the treaty?" "That is the whole of the treaty," Eleanor said, "for tonight. The rest, your grace, you will have to earn one ordinary day at a time, and I intend to hold you to it exactly that slowly." Spring came to Wraxham, with the particular thoroughness it always brought after a hard winter, and Rivenhall, through it, was proved not by any single scene, but by the accumulation of very small ones, each one meaning nothing alone and everything together. The way Eleanor's mother had once told her love was meant to be counted. Julian began riding out with her on the estate rounds, instead of sending her with the steward, not to oversee her work, but because, he said plainly the first morning he asked, he had found he preferred the company. He began asking questions that were not functional, what she was reading, whether she had slept, what she thought of the new tenant at Hollow Farm, beyond whether his rent was accurate. He moved his chair, without remark, from the head of the dining table to the seat beside hers, and the first time Eleanor noticed it she said nothing, only watched him do it again the next evening, and the next, until it had become simply where his chair was. There was one relapse, in April, and Eleanor was glad, afterward, that there had been, because it told her more than a flawless spring could have. Julian, faced with a minor dispute over grazing rights on the eastern boundary, settled it himself in an afternoon without consulting her. the old habits surfacing exactly the way old habits do, not from malice, but from 3 years of a groove worn too deep to notice he was walking in it. Eleanor heard of the settlement from Mrs. Hale before she heard it from him. "You decided the Aldous boundary dispute without me," she said that evening. Plainly, no accusation in it, only fact. Julian stopped. She watched him actually hear what he had done, the particular stillness of a man catching himself mid-stride. "I did. Out of habit, not intention. I am sorry. It will not happen again." "See that it does not," Eleanor said, and let the matter close there, because she had learned that a correction offered without theatre, accepted without argument, was worth a great deal more than a scene, and she found, watching her husband carry the correction quietly into the following weeks, that the relapse had done more to convince her of his change than 100 declarations could have. He gave her the second ring in June, in the walled garden, on no anniversary at all, which was, she understood, precisely the point. "It is not meant to replace your mother's," he said, turning the small velvet box in his hands before he opened it, a slim gold band, plain, set with a single garnet chosen, the jeweller had told him, to match the stone she already wore. "I asked the man in Fenbridge to match the colour as near as he could. I wanted something that sat beside what she gave you, not over it. I have spent a great deal of this spring thinking about the things you have carried alone for years, without my once asking to help carry them, and I could not undo that. I could only ask to add something to it. If you would let me." Eleanor looked at the ring a long moment, and then at her husband, who had not moved to place it on her hand himself, who had learned, finally, to offer rather than to install. "I would choose you," he said, before she could answer. "Eleanor, I have been choosing you, quietly, since the night in the tithe barn, and probably a good while before that, if I am honest, and I did not have the courage to say it until I had something to show for the choosing besides words. I am not asking you to say it back tonight. I am asking you to let me go on choosing you, in the ordinary way, for as long as you will have the patience to watch me do it." Eleanor held out her hand and let him place the ring beside her mother's, the 2 garnets catching the same June light, and she found, examining the fact with the same care she brought to every ledger she had ever balanced, that she was, for the first time in 3 years, entirely unafraid of what she felt. "I have been choosing you too," she said, "longer than I let myself admit. I simply required you to become someone worth the choosing before I said so aloud. 2 years passed the way the good years do, quickly and without much drama, and Rivenhall, by the second autumn, had become a house Eleanor scarcely recognised from the one she had married into, not because its walls had changed, but because the silence inside them had. Julian had made the tenant wage reform permanent that first spring, a fair schedule posted at every farm gate, and reviewed each Lady Day by Eleanor's own hand, and Josiah Reeves' boy Sam, grown 2 inches and considerably less inclined to hang about doorways unnoticed, had gone off that autumn to the small parish school Eleanor had funded out of her own income, the first Rivenhall tenant's child ever to be sent, and, everyone agreed, unlikely to be the last. Mrs. Norwood had married a solicitor's clerk in Fenbridge the following spring, and sent Eleanor, unprompted, an invitation the Duchess was glad to accept. Lord Bramwell had danced with Eleanor exactly once more, at the following year's harvest ball, and told her, with the particular dry humour of a man fully at peace with an old refusal, that he considered himself owed a permanent standing invitation to any assembly at which the Duke of Rivenhall required a reminder of his own good fortune. Julian had laughed at that, actually laughed, the sound still rare enough in that house to make the servants glance up from their work and smile without quite knowing why. The ring, both rings, worn together now, turned each morning out of habit rather than grief, no longer meant what it had meant on the night of the ball, a private mourning worn by a woman no one thought to ask about. It meant, Eleanor had told Julian once, quietly, in bed in the dark, a ledger with 2 entries instead of 1, the mother who had taught her what love was not, and the husband who had finally learned what it was. The house itself, Mrs. Hale liked to say to anyone who would listen, had taken up breathing again, the particular ease of old walls no longer holding their silence for a marriage that could not decide what it was. It showed in small things, doors left open that had once stayed closed out of habit, laughter carrying from the library on ordinary evenings, a chair beside a chair rather than a chair at the head of a long, cold table. She had stopped asking to be seen. She had made herself, quietly and without permission from anyone, impossible to unsee, not by demanding a place at the table, but by becoming the ledger the whole county learned to trust, the arithmetic no one could argue with, the woman whose composure had turned out to be not the absence of feeling, but its most disciplined form. Julian had once told her, at a ball, without meaning cruelty, that she was suitable, and had required nothing further. He told her now, 2 years on, in the ordinary quiet of a Tuesday evening with no audience at all, that she was not what he had bargained for. He had bargained for a capable duchess. He had gotten a woman he would have chosen, freely, with nothing at stake, and everything to lose, in any life he might have lived, not because she had finally become worth loving, because he had finally become capable of seeing what had been true all along. She had never asked to be maintained. She had only ever asked to be seen, and the difference, she had learned, was not a small one. It was the whole of the distance between a marriage that manages and a marriage that lives. And it was not a thing, once a woman had built it for herself, that anyone could ever again take away.